Now, before I get started, I have a confession to make. When Paul contacted me and asked me to talk about non-state political violence in a democratic transition framework, I thought, sure, I can do this. I've been doing it for a long time. This is right up my alley. I'll be happy to do it. And then I thought, this is going to be a room full of really smart people who already know a great deal about this topic. What am I going to tell them that they don't already know? And the answer is nothing. There is nothing I can say on this topic that you don't already know. So rather than waste 15 minutes of your time hearing something that you've already learned several times over, what I'm going to do is address some of what I think the shortcomings are in the scholarship, especially in this area. And that doesn't mean that I'm going to criticize previous scholars on this. What I'm going to do is, for you to understand where I'm going with this, you have to understand where I'm coming from. Okay, so I've been a professor at the National Defense University in the United States for the last 9 years. That means I'm quasi-academic. Partially engaged in the academic structures, partially engaged in policy discussions, right, and trying to solve policy problems both in the US and overseas. I also worked in the United States Senate, so it was very focused on solving problems. We identify problems and what are we going to do about them. And in a couple of months, I'll be moving into the private sector, doing sort of international business transactions from a law practice that I'll be joining as a partner. So I have a very keen interest not just in describing problems like political violence and democratic transitions, but in solving them. And the criticism that we often see of scholars on this topic is that they don't actually offer any solutions. Or the ones that they do offer are so strategic that they're not helpful. That they're so high level that they don't give us anything to grab onto to try to solve these problems. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about the phenomenon of the sort of dynamic relationship between political violence, especially terrorism, and democratic transitions, just so that we're all on generally the same page. But then I want to focus most of the discussion on what we do about it. And I want to do that by building on the last panel. To my mind, the socioeconomic portions of what led us to a democratic transition in the first place are probably the best place to start addressing the political violence that often accompanies it. So I'm going to focus on economic opportunities and what the state, international organizations, civil society, and the private sector can all do together to sort of build socioeconomic, a base on which a democratic transition can flourish. So I'll start first with just a little bit about this dynamic between political violence and democratization. So we know democracies in general are fairly peaceful forms of government in general, right? On the international sphere. But periods of democratization have a much higher likelihood of political violence than other political periods, either in democratic states or in authoritarian states. That this period of transition is particularly vulnerable to violence, especially non-state violence, but also violence by the state against its own people. Now, I think it's fairly intuitive why this happens, right? You remove old structures, and often the old political, bureaucratic, economic structures are the very reason that you have a democratic transition in the first place, right? People want to get rid of the old. At the same time, the new institutions either don't exist yet or are weak. They haven't established credibility. People don't trust them yet. So you have a political vacuum that's created. You've removed the old, but you haven't been able to replace the old strong institutions with new strong institutions yet. So you have this political vacuum. You've got a space where political competition can occur, and where there is competition, there is often violence. So the violence accompanies these democratic transitions. Now, the scholarship on this area has several open questions. I'm going to leave a lot of gaps in my discussion here, right? I have no doubt that you all will identify where those gaps are, and if you're interested in them, we can talk about them in the question and answer in the discussion period. But I'm just going to focus on a couple of points here. One is there's a debate over structure, whether this is entirely a structural issue of violence in democratic transitions, or whether, or to what degree elites especially matter in the degree of violence that occurs in these periods. There's one particular strand of research in this area that talks about elite manipulation of violence, and that I think is worth just a moment of our time. Again, lots of open questions here, but what some have recently come to find is that the most intense political violence occurs when incumbent elites feel threatened. So when a group of elites can see the handwriting on the wall and knows that a political transition is coming, we are more likely to see political violence, both by the state and by non-state groups. I think we probably saw some of this in the Arab world immediately following the Egyptian and Tunisian transitions. Once other leaders in the Arab world started to see that this was not isolated to Tunisia, that it was not isolated to Egypt, then we saw violence in Libya, we saw it in Syria, we saw it in other places as well. And there were, of course, exceptions to this rule, and some countries, like for instance Yemen, made it through this transition in a relatively peaceful and different way than others. But in general, I think we saw that incumbent elites who were threatened by changes of regime, we saw much more violence in those transitions. Now, what are we going to do about all of this? First thing that I think will help us frame some solutions about where to go. How do we reduce political violence in democratic transitions? Because after all, that's why we talk about this stuff. The first thing to do is to cut through the noise. Sir, I think it was you in the last session said that you thought that ultimately most of the grievances that brought about democratic transitions essentially had to do with economic opportunities. I would add dignity to that, but they're interrelated, right? There's a desire for self-respect, for the state to respect the individual. And that often is very much coupled with the opportunity to have a better life for yourself and for your children, right? And often that's economic in nature. So if we look at those twin issues, dignity, economic opportunity, as really the subtext for all of the other political grievances that get aired, right? It might be about freedom of expression. It might be about party politics. It might be about the electoral system. It might be about the role of religion in the state. Whatever. They all come down to dignity and opportunity, I think, essentially. So that can color what we do to try to reduce political violence. The second step that we can take in trying to determine what to do about violence, especially terrorist violence in these arenas, is to recognize that the revolutionary actors, the people who bring about democratic transitions in the first place, they don't agree about much as far as what to do about problems, right? You have communists and leftists and trade unionists and capitalists and sort of secularists and Islamists and all kinds of people. The only thing they can really agree on is that the current system is rigged. It is unfair. It's only benefiting those that are connected to the regime, right? That in general, that's what they can all agree to. And they can all agree that promoting economic development is probably good for their own political future. That if they can increase people's well-being, they will probably do well in the democratic system that is to follow. So we have an agreement that the system needs to change, And we have an agreement among these groups, most likely, that we want to increase economic development. We want to spread the wealth around a little more. Third, let's recognize what militant groups prey on. If you look at who they're looking for as their foot soldiers, they're looking especially for young people, frustrated young people. In particular, frustrated college-educated young people who don't have jobs, who have high expectations of their own lives and of what the state is to provide for them. I think somebody, I forget who it was, Haizam, maybe you mentioned waithood. That's who militant groups are focused on, is people in the midst of this waithood. And they're frustrated because they don't have the opportunities that they think they deserve most of the time. But, so this is a vulnerable population, but what if these people were empowered to be the creators of the economic opportunities that they're seeking? What if instead of waiting for someone to give them a job, they created their own job, right? That gives them both economic opportunity and a purpose. And we can train people to be entrepreneurs, right? And what is an entrepreneur but someone who sees a need and figures out a way to fill it? Now, one of the silver linings of many countries in transition is that there are plenty of needs to be filled. So there are plenty of opportunities for these folks to fill them. Then the fourth item that we can sort of look to in this situation is that militant groups often benefit from elite promotion of political violence, whether it's directly, whether the elites are sort of supporting them directly, or they're just sort of antagonizing people and calling for violence. If political opportunities are being closed down for the current elites in the new system, then my argument is that it's essential that we open up economic opportunities for them. That they have to have some reason to buy into the new system, right? They cannot be completely excluded from both politics and the economy, right? Because then they have no reason to buy in. They're much more likely to fight the system fairly strongly. So, how do we promote this broad-based economic growth? I think there are three ways to do it. One is through the legal framework, another is access to capital, and the third is creating an entrepreneurial culture. So the legal framework is actually fairly straightforward. You ask anyone who does rule of law promotion and they will tell you all about all of the things that you need to do to create a business environment, or sort of a legal environment that's conducive to economic growth and development. There's no secrets here. You remove barriers to market entry like capital requirements and red tape. You create fair and efficient contract enforcement. And here I think there are many folks in the international community who can aid in this effort, who can help countries establish those kinds of legal frameworks that can be useful. Second, though, is access to capital. Entrepreneurs, people who want to create economic opportunities, have to have money to be able to do that. We've seen a growth in microcredit and access to finance more generally throughout the developing world recently. Think of Grameen Bank, for instance, and think of M-Pesa in Kenya, right? Financial services have come to the unbanked. The unbanked have not gone to financial services, right? So to the extent that that can be extended in transitioning countries, we're probably moving in the right direction. But the private sector can't underwrite all of the loans that would be necessary to create an entrepreneurial culture. This is where the state and the international community comes in. The US, for instance, has a lot of programs with the US Trade and Development Agency, OPIC, the Exim Bank, even our own Department of Energy has sort of jump-started our renewable energy industry. The idea there is you take otherwise deserving business plans that can't get capital, maybe because of high political risk in their country or currency risk or whatever, But the role of the state is to basically, essentially, bankroll otherwise risky entrepreneurial ventures so that they can start to kickstart those ventures, and that's a job creation machine. Now, a lot of them will fail, right? Small businesses tend to fail, but some of them will succeed, and the successes are what matters. So that takes some money, but it's a lot cheaper than military intervention, right? So if we're thinking in the long term, we're probably moving in the right direction to sort of support entrepreneurs. And then lastly, creating an entrepreneurial culture. Not everyone knows how to start a business, right? I would have a hard time starting a business tomorrow, but you can teach people how to do it. You can mentor them, you can train them, you can support them throughout the process. And again, this is where you can have business elites from the indigenous business elites help do this, but also civil society, the international community can really can really push this issue in transitioning countries. So finally, the idea here is not to try to create developing world multinational corporations. The idea is to create a lot of small and medium-sized enterprises that can create opportunities that otherwise don't exist in these countries. Why is that important? One, it dries up the recruiting pool for militants, right? Other people have an opportunity, they have a purpose, and that matters. What militant groups give people is a purpose and an opportunity. And if you can channel that in a productive way, then you dry up the pool for recruits. Secondly, it expands the number of people with a stake in the new system. The democratic system is going to create some winners, and it's going to create some losers. The losers need a place to land, and creating businesses for them to land in, I think, is an opportunity to blunt some of the edges of a democratic transition. So with that, I'll stop. Again, I left a lot of gaps. I hope we can fill it in the discussion period. So thank you for your attention. I appreciate it.